This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
So this is Paul Verschure with Partha Mitra with the Convergent Science Network podcast. And in this episode, recorded as part of the CSN Barcelona Cognition, Brain and Technology Summer School, we're talking to Mandyam Srinivasan, also known as Srini. And Srini, in your lecture, you focused very much on the mental life of bees, if you want, with a special focus on memory.
Well, part of it, yeah. The first part was more on low-level vision and navigation.
Right.
And the second part was really more on the cognitive bits.
Right.
So we can start with the first part or the second part, whatever you prefer.
Good. Well, before we do that, how if we think about, let's say, the vision or the cognition in bees, could you give us like an intuitive description of the world in which a bee lives?
Well, I suppose it's okay. I mean, it probably depends on whether it's flying outdoors or staying indoors in the hive. Outdoors, I suppose the world is very similar to what we experience. I mean, it's mostly visually oriented, or visually dominated, I would say, with a bit of olfaction thrown into. When you get close to a flower, you smell it and you either go towards it because you recognize the smell, or you avoid it because it's the nectar is not good over there. But within the hive, it's of course a completely different situation. It's totally dark, and it's there's a lot of pheromonal contact, and there's a lot of acoustic signaling going on, and that's stuff that a lot of other people are studying. I don't know a lot about that, but it's certainly it's mostly acoustic, I would say, inside the hive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So starting out then with the visual capabilities of bees, this would then support their navigational skills.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So how do you decompose vision in bees?
Okay. I mean, as you probably know, insects have these compound eyes, which are many facets, and we have these so-called simple eyes, camera lens type eyes. And so optically, superficially, there's a difference between insect vision and our own vision in terms of just how the visual information is collected or sampled. But the more fundamental difference, as I was saying in the talk, is the two eyes of an insect. When I say two eyes, I mean the right compound eye and the left compound eye. They're very close together. So it becomes very difficult to do stereo if you're an insect, because the baseline is very small. And the only way you can do stereo, the only circumstance under which you can do stereo is when your object of interest is very close to your eyes, which is when you get a much bigger disparity, of course. So this is where it looks like insects have gone a different route, and they... sorry, am I distracting you?
No. I'm distracting myself. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Which is where they have to use a very active mode of sensing the world in 3 dimensions, and this is done by physically moving in it and measuring the optic flow that various objects around them generate.
Right.
So something that's very close to you, if you're moving in a straight line, something that's very close to you moves by very rapidly in your visual field, and at high speed tells you that this is very close. And something that's very far away, on the other hand, moves very slowly, and that tells you that that object is at infinity. And what we've done is a nice series of experiments, maybe the first ones, I suppose, with insects, to show that insects really gauge distance based on how rapidly the images are moving. So this is done with flying them through tunnels and moving the patterns on the walls, as you know. Yeah.
But now, in insect vision, which is a very active area of research, there's, if you want, let's say, a prototypical design of a vision system, fairly hierarchical, where you slowly move to, let's say, a bit more complex and integrative processing of vision-derived signals. But in what sense does the bee visual system really deviate from that sort of standard template?
Okay,
what are the unique features?
Okay, what we're finding, I suppose the fly, most of that work, the initial work, has been done with the fly. And there, the motion sensing system has been studied very well there. But I think it's just one part of what goes on in an insect visual pathway. I mean, there's lots of other things happening. For example, in bees, again, we're finding what seems to be almost certainly multiple parallel pathways. So some of which function the way Reichardt described it with this, correlation type motion detector. But all of these other mechanisms that are used to sense range, for example, they don't seem to obey the Reichartian laws.
Okay, what
They seem to
sense?
have different. They seem to be more accurate measuring devices for measuring image velocity, independently of the spatial frequency content, and independently largely of the contrast of the scene as well. And if you think about it, you need that because you want to know how far away a surface is, regardless of what its texture is, spatial texture, or what its contrast is, right? So you need a robust system, and the Reichardt system does not deliver that robustness to you. So there must be other systems there which are acting in parallel, or which are processing using several different Reichardt detectors, maybe multiple channels to get that what do you call it? That vertical information on velocity. So that's one thing. Apart from that, of course, honeybees have excellent color vision, trichromatic color vision, which they need to detect flowers, recognize flowers. That's and they're really a beautiful learning machine. You can train the bee to learn a color in half an hour. 5 rewards is enough for a bee to learn a color. So they do great with that. And of course, they have a beautiful polarization sense as well, which you probably know. So to analyze the polarization pattern of the sky and use that to as a compass. If the sun is hidden behind a cloud, then they can't use the sun anymore, but they can still use the polarization pattern in the sky to work out which direction to fly.
Right.
So all of that is there in the bee, which I think, well, color vision certainly is not as well developed in the fly. And with polarization vision, no one really knows for sure. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
You had mentioned that when you had these artificial small tunnels set up, you could fool the bee into thinking that it's flown a smaller distance.
A larger distance.
Flown a larger distance. So it's not entirely invariant to the environmental
Exactly.
cues.
No, you're right. Absolutely right. But what's neat about that is that, as I was saying, and when someone asked the question, so you would say, for example, if bees flew in different landscapes, they would give you different distance readings, right? Because the optic flow they've experienced could have been different. Let's say you fly over a plane, over a lake, for example, where there's almost no optic flow, as opposed to going through a dense forest. But what happens is that a bee that goes and finds a food source after it's flown over a lake comes back and does a dance, and it signals a certain amount of units of optic flow, which is the measure of distance. And then all the other bees take the same route. So they experience the same environment. So whatever calibrations or miscalibrations are happening, they're the same for all the bees. And so they cancel each other out, right? So that's the way I think, that's why the system probably works. But again, there's a little unsolved question there, because different bees can fly at different heights above the ground. And so if you fly higher, you'll experience a lower amount of optic flow. So the integrated flow will be lower. So the question is then, do bees actually measure height and take that into account when they're doing their odometry? Or do they all fly at the same height? We don't know that. There's some anecdotal observations which say bees fly typically about 2 meters above the ground. But whether that's really the case, no one really knows for sure.
But if you would have something like a polarized light compass, if you want, you could always use that to recalibrate, right? And make yourself your distance estimate independent of your altitude.
Well, the polarization compass will tell you only which direction you're flying in. It won't tell you your height above the ground.
Yeah, but then you could ignore it because you just instruct your fellow bees to fly in a certain orientation with respect to that.
Yeah, but how do you know how far to go, though?
The optic flow will
that's the
depend
thing
on
that
how
says,
far you are on the ground.
So you see, you have to give 2 bits of information to specify a location in a plane, right? You need the direction and you need the distance. So you got to specify the position of the food source in polar coordinates. So the polarization pattern of the sun, they give you the compass direction. So they tell you, okay, go this way. But then you also have to tell them how far to go before you start looking for the food.
But you could also argue that the more minimal model will just take the orientation until you hit a target.
A target. Yeah, you could. But you see, what is also interesting and probably subtle is that when these bees come back home and dance and they're advertising direction as well as distance, and they're also passing out these nectar samples to these other bees. So quite often a bee will stop this dancing bee and beg it for nectar samples, and this other bee will, regurgitate some of the nectar that's brought out. And so this bee can actually assess how good that nectar is. And based on the distance signaled, it can decide whether it's really worthwhile going all that way or not. So these bees are evaluating dances that are being produced by different foragers coming back from different food sites, which are advertising different food sources. and they're making up their minds.
Okay.
So do I go a long way to get to a good food source? Do I fly a shorter route to get to a not so good food source? What is a trade-off there? And apparently they're working out the trade-off in their minds.
So what kind of correlations did you find?
Between?
Well, for instance, the animals that decide to go off on a long foraging run.
But
what's the difference? What's the difference in the nectar?
It seems like, so this is not our own work, but other labs have investigated it. And it looked like what these bees are doing is that they're looking at the ratio of calories brought in terms of energy from the sugar, nectar, versus calories expended to get to the food source.
Okay.
And they're trying to maximize that.
But then still an alternative could also be that you sample the nectar to get a chemical fingerprint of your target.
Yeah.
And this could help in your navigation because then again you could go for some odor plume that matches that template to get to your target.
Sure. No, you could do that. It's harder though, because what happens is typically if you can say, okay, this bee comes back and gives you a scent of lavender, right? So because you go looking out for lavender, you don't know which direction to go. And remember, it's not just a simple diffusion process. People in the old days used to think, these scents just diffuse nicely and you have a nice diffusion gradient. And you just go up the gradient and you'll find the food source, right? No, it's not like that. When wind is blowing, the whole thing is very turbulent and you get these little filaments of, scent that are moving around. And you've got to be lucky to hit one of those filaments.
Sure.
And then you can zigzag, as you probably know, across the filament and get to that. You can do it, but it's tedious.
Of
tedious.
course. Sure.
Tedious. And there's some evidence that insects do it. When they're close to the goal, they do start looking for the scent. And certainly they're using that information too to guide their final thing. Yeah.
But you've shown in your controlled studies that once you've put one of the bees through your tunnel with a controlled distance, it can signal distance to the bees, which then will fly and will skip sources of food to go to the food source at the right distance.
They're definitely paying attention to the dance, no doubt about that. I mean, I guess Paul's question was, why do they even need a dance? But there's no doubt that they are using it. That's definitely the case. Yeah.
No, I was just trying to see what would be the minimal model.
The minimal thing would certainly be, I mean, if you had, you got the scent given to you at the hive and the nectar tasted good, you could just go out looking for that.
Exactly.
It'll take you a long time. It won't be very efficient.
No, and you get some heading vector, right? It's okay.
Some heading vector. Yeah. Okay, if you get a heading vector, okay. Okay. But while you're going through all that trouble, you might as well even, provide the distance, right? I mean, it's one more parameter.
But remember, we were trying to solve the problem, how to deal with altitude,
So
right?
actually, it's interesting, Paul. So this is another thing that came up in the discussion. So how does the dance actually evolve, right? And so people are not really sure. But there's a lot of evidence that other insects will dance too. Completely out of context. So,
like which
there's
ones?
A species of butterfly, for example, apparently, which it's a solitary butterfly. So it flies a certain distance, and then when it lands, it does a waggle dance. It waggles its abdomen, just like the bee,
but without an audience.
Without an audience, exactly. So, but no one really knows why. But it's there. It's some kind of epiphenomenon. Yeah. So maybe it's something metabolic or some other thing. And so maybe that has been picked up by these bees. And being exploited,
right,
as a signaling mechanism.
Has anyone measured the accuracy with which the distance is signaled? So if different bees end up at different distances from the target or at different angles, has anyone measured the spread?
So typically the distance, the scatter and the distance, the waggle durations is about 10%. And so it's always a percentage of the mean distance. But what is interesting is that with the angular error, as we were discussing the other day, it looks like when the food source is close by, there's a certain angular error in the direction indication. But when the food source is very far away, the angular error is much smaller. So they're trying to account for the fact that if you have the same angular error, that will signal a much bigger patch when you're further away compared to when you're closer, right? So they're trying to compensate for that. There's some built-in compensation, I guess.
But this is interesting because then apparently this compensation comes at a cost. Because when something is nearby, so it's easier to find, they seem to put in less effort to communicate that parameter.
Yes.
So what's that cost exactly?
You're saying cost in terms of doing an accurate dance?
Right, exactly. It seems to
Why?
be.
So are you saying why are they being sloppy when? So
well,
that's interesting. Maybe I don't know what the energetic requirements are for doing a dance, and whether precision involves more. It involves more concentration.
Are they really being more sloppy, or is it that when the waggle dance is longer, the audience gets to integrate for a longer period of time and therefore gets a more accurate estimate?
The actual variance itself. So people have measured physically the variance in the axis orientation, and that seems to go down.
But is that a simple consequence of having a longer dance?
It's possible. It's possible that it's a measurement.
No real
it's possible that even with the humans who are measuring these dances, maybe there is an element of increased accuracy simply because they have a longer sample. Right? That's a good point.
But that's only true when the waggle dance is a highly controlled, low noise expression of these parameters. Is that true?
Yeah. So you mean how noisy is it? It's pretty noisy. It's not clean.
Right. So longer integration.
Yeah.
Would then possibly help you to have a bit more accurate estimate.
And the extreme limiting case is when the food source is very close to the hive. When, as you probably know, there's no longer even a waggle dance. So the waggle disappears completely and it becomes just a round dance.
Right.
And that simply says, okay, I'm not going to tell you exactly which direction to go. Just look within a small radius, 50 meters of the hive, and you'll find it.
Right.
So it becomes very imprecise as you get very close to the origin.
But the two interesting aspects of this, I find them interesting right now, is that you could also argue that on the one hand, it's the dancing bee itself who has integrated more or less information. Like if you have to sort of unwind this clock, you have been winding up the clock for a shorter period of time when you found the nectar nearby. So there's less to display in the waggle dance. Would that be an alternative interpretation that would make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the original people think the way this whole dance first started was in the tropical bees, which were living not inside these dark hollow chambers, nests that we find in the European bees now, but outdoors. And there, most of these primitive bees now have dance on a horizontal surface, not on a vertical surface. And they're doing a kind of a scaled down version. They're simulating the flight to the hive, to the food source. They're just basically pointing in the direction of the food, and they're doing they're coming back and doing another.
Okay.
So it's exactly as though they're doing a miniature version of the actual flight. So in a sense, that makes sense, right? So they're coming back and they're sort of replaying that.
But that's interesting because that creates a new problem for the observer, because now the observer must extract this direction of movement independent of their own position.
Okay, in the outdoor arena, that's fairly easy, I think, because you basically have to face in the direction that the bee is waggling, and then you know where the sun is.
Yep.
So I say, okay, I'll fly in such a way that I keep the sun over there,
right?
Or the polarization pattern in the sky if the sun is not visible, if there's some patch of clear sky. Okay, I'll say, okay, I know the orientation of the vector should be that. I'll hold that and go along, and I'll go for a distance that tells me, how many optical flow units I should experience. And then when I get close to that, I'll start looking.
Right. But now if I take a bee and I observe the bee dance, but now I rotate it a few times and then I let it go, will it still orient itself correctly?
Theoretically, it should.
No, in practice. They're not all theoretical physicists,
That's a good point. That's a good point. I don't know if anyone's done that.
Because that's a bit the issue.
Very interesting.
Because the way you describe it is that you physically orient yourself.
Okay. As far as people know, well, no one really knows whether bees have a vestibular organ as yet. If they do, of course, they could get messed up. Right. Absolutely, right? Now, the way people think, they assess, they calibrate their orientation is the dance is done on the vertical plane inside the hive. And the direction of the sun is symbolized by the vertically upward direction, which is the direction of negative gravity. And people think they have a sense of gravity. Looking at the way, for example, your abdomen hangs in relation to the thorax, that tells you which direction gravity is, and that's your direction calibration.
Right.
That's what people think. But in addition to that, if they have something that senses your angular velocity, as in a vestibular thing, no one really knows.
Okay. But then how do they map that back in the horizontal plane relative to the sun? Because then gravity is not helping you.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Completely unknown.
Okay.
It's very interesting. Also, how do they hold this information?
Exactly.
There's the automatic information. They go some distance, and it can be several minutes before they come back home and dance, right? So where is that information stored? Is it stored as a charge in the membrane potential of some neuron? Or is it stored as an activity in some kind of place cell? My own feeling is that really the mushroom bodies and the insects really are like the hippocampus in vertebrates, and there might be place cells. So there could be certain place cells. As you go along to a food source, presumably successive place cells are lighting up.
So
and then
now that there is more bee genetics and molecular biology coming on, are people thinking of manipulating bees to knock out
knocking out
genes?
the dancing gene, for example? I mean, I don't know
has that been done?
No, people I'm sure they're trying to do that.
And are people breeding bees for certain traits?
They've been doing that for a long time, even before all the gene was mapped, of course. I mean, basically the idea is to breed bees that will produce a lot of honey.
No, I meant more in the context of the waggle dance.
Bees that signal better signalers of
or worse, or worse.
Interesting. It would be very interesting if you can find out the gene, a combination of genes that, for example, are responsible for the dance. That's a very basic thing, right?
Could one not even screen bees?
I'm sure that's being done. I'm sure that's being done. I'm not a molecular biologist myself, but I'm sure there are people doing it. There's Gene Robinson in the US who's been doing stuff along those lines. I don't know if he's actually succeeded yet, but that'll be really exciting.
And we started discussing whether this was learned behavior or innate behavior. You had some comments on that?
Yeah, this is just a guess. I can't be sure, but I think it's probably the basic dance is pre-programmed. It's there like a child that has its gait already built in, but it's probably learned and refined during the first few days. The first 3 weeks I spent just not doing any foraging. As you know, they're just acting as nurse bees inside the hive, so there's no need to do any dancing. But it's only after that, when they start to go and forage, that they start to need to dance. And that's the point, by the way. I don't know if Nick mentioned that, but when the bee first starts to go out and forage, the mushroom bodies expand hugely. So that map is being laid down. And there's another piece of evidence that
that's interesting.
It's really like the London taxi drivers.
But are the mushroom bodies, this very central structure in the bee brain, expanding in some uniform fashion, or is it certain lobes of it that expand more than others?
I don't know about the details. The calyces are the cup-shaped structures. Yep. They enlarge hugely.
Okay.
And there's still a debate about whether the number of neurons is actually going up, or whether it's just the density of the neuropil. So it could be that the dendrites are getting, longer.
Sure.
And developing more synapses. There's a bit of a debate, I think, about whether the number of neurons, whether new neurons are being created. I don't know if that's still the case.
Okay.
But certainly all those calyces get very big.
Yeah, so then the question becomes, it's a bit of shift and also towards memory, if you want, right? Because you were talking about something like a place cell type response in these mushroom bodies. So if we start with, let's say, the basic task these bees have to solve is, okay, here I go, I'm navigating out, I'm finding some nectar, I'm flying back home, and now I'm going to tell everybody about it.
Yeah.
So where's the memory of that? What's the memory of that? What are the physiological correlates of it?
Nobody has the foggiest idea. That's $1 million thing. I mean, where is this information stored? Again, my guess is that it'll have to be somewhere in the mushroom bodies. It'll probably be some place cell that's firing that says, okay, this is the location. And that has to be translated somehow into producing a dance.
Right. No, but let's approach it maybe different. Let's see, what do we know about bee memory structures that could help us understand answering this question?
Well, unfortunately, almost nothing.
Well, we know a little bit about, let's say...
Yeah, all that people know is that if you knock out the mushroom bodies, a lot of learned associations are lost. But that's about it, really. That's about it.
There's a little bit that you were mentioning that certain things the bees are easier to train, certain tasks the bees can be trained in easier, whereas other tasks are difficult. And you also had some time courses associated with that.
So there's gradations of learning. So, for example, the simplest kind of learning would be color learning. It's just so fast and so robust. If a bee learns a color, we learned it, as I said, in half an hour, 5 visits.
But that means the bee gets reward rewarded to find that color, and it will find it within 5 trials.
That's right. So the idea, the idea is, okay, you do the reinforcement 5 times. So the classic, von Frisch experiment was to have train them to come on a piece of blue paper, which had a drop of sugar water, and then of course he did a very nice. He just didn't simply do 2 different colors because they could be discriminating the colors not on the basis of color but on the basis of intensity, on the basis of brightness.
Sure.
So what he did was he had a blue sheet that he rewarded the bees on, and then so they came 5 times, got rewarded on that, and then he gave them a test where this blue sheet, he took away the sugar water, there was no food anymore, and the blue sheet was placed in the midst of, or in the general vicinity of a bunch of other sheets of different gray levels. And so then he said, okay, let this trained bee come and choose where it wanted to land, and it picked the blue. So regardless of the intensity, it was perceiving hue as a separate, quality.
Right, exactly.
And landing on that thing. So, and that again takes only 5 rewards.
And
so
what's the generalization capability of the bee? If I now put this blue patch of paper among many other different kinds of blues.
The delta lambda discrimination is almost as good as that of a human. It's about 5 nanometers. So if you do experiments with spectral lights, 5 nanometers. They also have very nice color constancy, the way we do. So they can perceive the shade of blue to be, they can recognize this irrespective of the illumination, largely. So, evening versus midday. So that color constancy computation is going. All animals need it, probably, and bees have it too, of course, which is nice.
That's a really exciting issue as well. But maybe we should get back to that later before we understand memory, or at least understand what we don't understand about it. So
I think the behavior leads a long way ahead of the physiology, I think, and the circuit knowledge of what the circuits are doing.
But then let's look at from a performance perspective. I mean, how many landmarks can I memorize as a bee?
Okay, it depends on how you train them. I don't know if anyone has looked at that systematically, but certainly you can, in terms of discrimination, you can train bees to distinguish between horizontal versus vertical patterns. You can train them to distinguish colors, as I mentioned. You can train them to distinguish between odors, different scents, and you can train them to associate odors with colors. So you can have a bee come into a maze, it gets a whiff of scent, and then you can train to say, if you smell lavender, then we go to a decision chamber. You have to pick the blue disc. If you smell lemon, when you go to the decision chamber, you got to pick the yellow disc, for example.
Right.
So they can learn to make those associations. You can also train them to do kind of a delayed master sample task. You're familiar with the delayed master sample task?
Yeah, of course. But just define it.
So the idea is that, the classical experiment is you flash a stimulus, let's say a color to a person, blue, and then later on, a few seconds later, they're given a choice between blue and yellow. So if you see blue as your sample stimulus, you got to pick the matching stimulus with blue.
What's the delay the bees can handle?
About 5 seconds.
Okay. And then after 5 seconds, it drops off rapidly or gradually?
It drops off gradually, and about 5, it's close to random.
Okay, but
they can also learn non-matching. So pick the stimulus that does not match, and they can also learn to match across stimulus modalities. So you can train them to do the matching task using scents, and then expose them to a visual task on which they haven't been trained, and they will do the matching. So they've learned the concept of matching from the smell task, and they're applying it to visual task.
So they generalize the rule?
Exactly.
But both for matching and non-matching?
Yes.
Okay.
Isn't that nice?
That's amazing.
That's pretty amazing.
That's really cool. Okay. But now...
Still don't know how it's useful in nature. Here we're treating these animals as a lab rat. I can't imagine that it's... Okay, certain context, maybe when you land on a flower and you get some, a good reward there, you might want to seek out a similar flower which has the same color. So in that sense, there's a thing. But you're not. You see, you're in the lab experiment. You're not being rewarded on the sample stimulus, right? It really. So I find it hard to think of a situation in nature where this particular task has to be applied. But they can do it. They can do it. You see.
But why is that so hard? I mean, if here you are, I'm Mr. Bee flying around. I'm visiting different flowers, different colors, different scents, and everything. And there might be contingent relations among these flowers. That's the rule, right? So maybe when I visit, let's say, a yellow neutral flower, I should not go to the blue one because I get absolutely nothing. Well, if I first go towards the yellow one and then to the red one that was hidden behind it, I get a reward. So now I can start to learn contingencies in my environment.
Okay, that's sure. You could do that, but you got to Okay, they can. Okay, let me say this one thing. I don't know if that answers your question. They can learn. It's called, what do you call it? It's not. It's symbolic delayed master sampling. So not just direct matching of stimuli, but saying, for example, if I see blue at the entrance, then I should pick the vertical grading versus the horizontal, opposed to the horizontal grading in the second, in one decision chamber, and then you can cascade this. You can go to a second decision chamber where you have a choice between two other stimuli, for example, a radial pattern versus a set of concentric circles. So if you see blue, you pick vertical and you pick radial. If you see yellow, then you pick the other stripe orientation and the other pattern. So all those contingencies, they can learn those contingencies. Now, so you think that'll be useful in nature?
For problem solving, I mean, these animals will find themselves in complex situations. They have to navigate through, let's say, dense growth. There might be relationships between flowers.
Yeah. So the chances are in nature you probably won't find the stimulus changing in the same location, but you could certainly apply it to two different trajectories. Right. For example, if I come to this location, I recognize there's blue something here, and that tells me how I should proceed.
Exactly.
Whereas if I see something else here, so
moreover, it can pick up regularities among plants because let's say the plant from which you want to get the nectar, the flower, might not be easily visible from their altitude. Yeah. But however, the tree just next to it is.
Sure.
Right. So and maybe the flowers you like grow close to certain trees. This is completely reasonable, right? So now I can extract these regularities from my environment and immediately apply them.
I agree. Yeah. Well, thank you
for
pointing it out.
How's my bee psychology doing?
I feel a lot more encouraged about what I'm doing.
Great. We're so pleased that we got to have you here. But
what got you interested?
You're giving me a reason to live.
Great. But
what got you interested in bees in the first place?
Oh, it's purely accident. Everything I've done in my life has been just not planned at all. So when I did my undergraduate in electrical engineering, as you probably know, in Bangalore, and when I was doing my master's, my professor suggested, and that was, by the way, my master's it was called Applied Electronics and Servo Mechanisms in those days. So it's mostly control theory and electronics. Too soft? I'm sorry. And with the masters, my professor said, why don't you do something biological? Why don't you try to model a biological system using the control system that you've been studying? And so we decided to try and model the human eye movement system as a target tracking, system with a moving target. So that's how I got interested in this thing. And when I went to the US to do my PhD there, I was looking for some project in the area of, interface between biology and engineering. And it turned out the only person who was doing anything in that area was the person who was working on insect eyes. So I got into fly vision in that way. And then when I went to Zurich in Switzerland was one of the world's, sort of leading areas in bee work. So there's a lady called Miriam Lehrer, who's unfortunately passed away now, who is the world's expert in training bees.
She was with Rudiger Wehner?
Exactly. So it was in Rudiger Wehner's lab, yeah. So that's where I learned all about bees. Okay. So it was purely by accident, but what a wonderful accident. They're just amazing creatures.
Right. And so, but how long ago was that your first encounter with the bees?
Well, if you ask me to give away my age.
No, we won't go that far.
Well, that would have been 1982 when I was a young assistant professor.
Okay. But then, so the bee is still your main target preparation in the empirical work?
I would say so. Yeah, we're starting to work a little bit with birds as well, but bees are the main thing. Yeah.
So then there are two issues to explore, right? So with respect to the bee cognition, we touched a little bit on this issue of memory. But now, so is this sort of the ability to extract these symbolic rules? Would you see that as really the highest level of bee cognition that can be achieved, or are there other tricks in their cognition bag?
There are a few things which are kind of striking. That's one thing. The other thing we were talking about the other day was because maze learning, they learn to go through labyrinths and various kinds of labyrinths. But there's also the business of breaking camouflage and perceiving camouflage objects which they normally would not see. So
how does that work?
Well, for example, you probably know this picture of this Dalmatian dog that's hidden behind a pattern of camouflage dots.
It's a dog I never see.
You never see it, right? But once someone traces the outline for you, and you see that same image again, it pops out. You see the Dalmatian every time.
I always say no, but it's
true. But you do, it's true. Well, bees seem to have that property too. So if you can give them a hint, initially when you show them two camouflage objects and try to train them to distinguish between them, they don't seem to do it. But if you give them a hint by showing them uncamouflaged versions of the same two objects, and you train them to discriminate those two, and then you show them the camouflage objects, they can pick them out.
Right.
And not only that, once they've learned how to break the camouflage, you can give them novel camouflage objects. And without the pre-training, they will do the task, learn the task. So you really taught them a different way in which to see the world.
That's pretty impressive.
Which is not bad, isn't it?
Do you think all these skills have given the bees an evolutionary advantage? Are there more bees than would be there otherwise?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I don't know to what extent it depends on how much predation there is, and how many creatures that are out there trying to eat these creatures. But that certainly is the fact that they can sting has certainly kept them alive for quite a long time. And as you know, there's also these wonderful bee mimics. There are lots of insects which don't sting, which have evolved to mimic the bee because other birds will stay away from them because they look like a bee. They taste beautiful, but the birds just avoid them because they've been conditioned to avoid any bee.
But that's more the sting, though.
That's the sting.
How are their cognitive abilities helping them?
Oh, I think, well, all I can say is it certainly helps them become more efficient foragers. I mean, there's this recent beautiful work that was done, not in our lab, but in the lab of a chap called James Neer. And he discovered that when a bee comes back and dances and to advertise a food source, and another bee is watching this dance, and it has been to that food source and has had trouble. It's been attacked by a spider, for example. This bee will then headbutt this dancing bee and stop it from dancing because it's a dangerous food source. And this stopping is very target specific. So it stops this dance only when the bee is advertising that particular food source, nothing else. And also only if this bee has come back badly damaged. If this bee has had a fight with the spider and it has actually won, no problem.
Okay. Right.
So I think that's getting to the point where these creatures are, I would say, almost human.
It's pretty impressive. Well, I never stung a spider though, but I used to work on that. But the thing is that the memory of these bees that would be providing, let's say, the core infrastructure for these cognitive capabilities seems to have, let's say, varying time windows in which it operates and is stable, right? So how many, let's say, would the distinction between a short and long-term memory be sufficient to describe bee memory?
Yeah,
or do you see more stages?
Well, there's also working memory. So this delayed master sample is a kind of working memory, right? And that lasts about 5 seconds. And there is the short-term memory, people say, which lasts about an hour. And that's really, and then if beyond that, it gets put into long-term memory. Now, exactly where the short-term memory resides, is it in the mushroom bodies or is it somewhere else?
Right.
No one really knows. I mean, it's very sad. I mean, the main problem, I think, is, as usual, the funding for insect work is not as good as it is with vertebrates. So really, the physiology and even the anatomy. Well, the anatomy, thanks to people like Nick, is really doing very well. But the physiology is really suffering.
But now about the stability of this memory. For instance, if the bee comes back and it dances, does that compromise the memory of that location, you think, in any way?
Good point. A good point. No one's looked at that. I mean, why should it?
Well, it has to recall it, right? So the memory might become unstable because it has to be recalled, replayed in some form.
Oh, so you're saying every time you recall, you might lose the memory trace?
Well, there are some theories of memory that go in that direction, right? Because it means recall would mean you have to make this again the memory again accessible, and you pay a price for that.
Okay, that's a good point. I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that question. But as you probably know, the dance is done only after the bee has visited the food site several times. And also, by then, this particular experienced bee will not even be relying on its own dance information to get to the food source. It'll be using a sequence of landmarks and things that it's learned to go along the way.
Right.
So that's why, although on a cloudy day, when the sun is covered and the whole sky is cloudy and there's no polarized light or sun, there's no dancing. The bees don't dance. But the bees that already know the food source will continue to forage because they don't need that information anymore. I mean, it's like you and I, we know a familiar place like this beach that we're going to. I don't know it, but you know it. But I would be using vector information because you've given me that vector information, but you won't be using it. You'll just be using a sequence of landmarks, right?
That's right.
That's how these bees do it. The experienced bees do it that way.
So the information hidden in the dance is really very crude.
Yes.
Crude information about the
environment. And it's kind of dispensed with, once the bee has advertised the food source and enough recruits have been collected, they basically forget about it. Right. The dance is not done anymore.
Okay.
But when a new food source comes up, then, of course, the dancing starts again.
Okay. But so now another part of your work, which might also be sort of have its roots in your engineering background, is you have been mapping a lot of this understanding of insect vision and behavior onto machines, onto robots.
Yeah, right? That again, that's also something that we didn't think of about ourselves. And sounds a bit stupid because, this first thing that we published on bees navigating down corridors, we didn't even think of it as anything that had potential engineering applications. But then after that work got published, a number of labs started to build robots that navigated down corridors using the same principle. And so we were actually sort of rather, latecomers to this thing. And in fact, I wasn't even really pursuing that a lot until a few US-based military funding agencies kind of just tapped us on the shoulder and said, hey, would you like to work on this? And here's some funding. Right. So that's how we got into it, really, ourselves.
But now tell me, so to what extent have these principles really generalized successfully? What can you really achieve with this? How close is it to what you see in these insects and so on?
So, as I was saying briefly the other day, so we're not really doing what you would call as biomimesis. So we're certainly not building a compound eye. It's probably a good idea to do that. If you have the expertise and the technology, you'll probably learn something nice. But our idea is to implement the principle. So instead of using a compound eye, we started out by using just a single camera, off-the-shelf camera, but building a specially shaped reflecting surface, just a mirror, but a specially shaped mirror. So you can play. We like to do things with mirrors. We're fond of mirrors. So with a mirror, for example, you can have either a spherical mirror. The trouble with a spherical mirror is that the radial gain is not constant. So what happens is if you look at the world with a hemispherical mirror, then the central part is magnified and the peripheral part is compressed, right? So you don't have uniform gain, elevational gain, as you might say. So we tailored a shape that produces uniform elevational gain, which is kind of useful because then, you don't lose resolution. You make, optimum use of the resolution, no matter where you're looking, right? So we use that on our aircraft, but with a standard camera. And that functions almost as well as a compound eye. There are a few blind zones, of course, like directly behind the camera, you can't see, and then behind the mirror you can't see, but you've got a good field of view there. Right. So that's what we do. So we implement panoramic vision in that way, and we don't build a flapping wing vehicle because that's too hard and we're not experts. We leave that to people like Mike Dickinson and so on. So we just build a vision system that uses some of the global principles that we discover from insect vision. So, for example, the finding that you need to measure optic flow in the two eyes and balance them in order to fly down the middle of a corridor. So, but the actual computation of the optic flow, again, we don't do it by using the biological algorithms, because we find that the biological algorithms don't do the job for us.
Why not?
Because they don't signal velocity reliably. They confound image velocity with the spatial frequency. They're not robust to changes in contrast. They're just a mess.
Well, just to clarify though, when you say biological algorithm, you really have in mind the Ricard model or models that people have made. You don't actually know what is going on inside the fly's brain,
exactly. So
perhaps
the true biological algorithm obviously works, right? Yeah, the real biological algorithm actually works. It still hasn't been. We don't know exactly what's happening in the nervous system to generate that. But behaviorally, the animal behaves as though it is sensing velocity very, very robustly.
No, because what I found interesting, I mean, it sounded a bit normative what you were saying, right? Because in some sense, the biological algorithm as a biological algorithm must be incredibly precise and robust, because it's computed in this really minuscule computational system.
When I say biological, right? I mean the known biological algorithm.
Right. Our interpretations of what
hypotheses or the recordings from neurons, the models of neurons that respond to motion.
Right.
Do not seem to do the job.
Well, that's perhaps a limitation of the people who did the modeling rather than of the fly.
Well, yeah, okay. In a way, they're trying to model the neuron's response, and they're probably right.
But they have done a bad job.
This particular neuron may show that response, but maybe they're not looking at the right neuron. Maybe
but there's something interesting here, Srini, that I think, of course, I understand you want to defend your colleagues, okay? That's all right. But the point is that indeed, people have taken the physiology, given that some sort of functional interpretation, but if you apply it to your aircraft, it is exposed to just different conditions, because we're not anymore, you're not tying this airplane to a table and show it fixed stimuli.
No.
It's now flying around. And the input sampling, the dynamics of the stimuli has really changed completely. And that's where these algorithms, of course, collapse, because they have been calibrated in highly controlled, rather artificial situations. So I think an interesting consequence of this observation is maybe that both the experimental context, the experimental paradigms have sort of been biasing our interpretation of what these systems do. And on top of that, possibly, our algorithmic function interpretation has just maybe been completely misguided. This is actually a consequence of your work.
I mean, the other way, I suppose, the way we're doing it presently is to put on a different hat completely. So when I say I want to measure optic flow, I simply... we've developed a whole bunch of just, very machine vision oriented algorithms, which work well. I mean, they give you the right answer. They've probably got nothing to do with the biology. So that's how we do it. But in the future, maybe there's a learning method or I don't know, genetically, what's the word? Genetic algorithm-based approach, which will give us something that produces a circuit that measures velocity accurately.
But because there's another aspect to this, right? That in some sense, what you're also using is computational hardware that has certain capabilities.
Yeah.
And you exploiting, let's say, algorithms people have developed using this kind of hardware. But biological hardware might have to optimize different parameters than the engineered hardware, because in the case of the bee, it must be flyable, it must be very compact, it must be energy efficient, and so on.
It's optimizing so many different criteria.
Right.
I agree completely, and it's not necessarily tuned to exactly what we want.
So therefore, if you talk about biomimetics, I think it might also be a good way to actually benchmark and validate our understanding of the real biological system.
I like to call it bioprincipics rather than biomimetics. So you abstract the principles. You don't slavishly copy the biology. Just abstract the higher order principles and try and implement them, right?
Sure.
And then test our ideas that way about whether it's using this principle or not.
Absolutely. Yeah. But earlier you said yourself that that's not then really what you do with with your airplanes.
With the aircraft, what we do is we want to see, okay, we know the fact that insect is now using optic flow to control its landing. Can we get an aircraft to use optic flow again to control its landing? The exact way in which optic flow is computed, we don't know in an insect. But we'll use our own way. We'll use our own engineering-based way. And that works. But
wait, this is funny, because in some sense, in the literature, people would make you believe that they do know how flying insects compute motion. They say it's the Ricard correlator.
Yeah,
So why do you say we don't know how it's computed?
Because it doesn't fit the behavioral data.
Tell me.
See, the thing with the Reichert correlator, the only thing it can reliably tell you, really, if it comes down to it, is the direction in which something is moving. Beyond that, information is very ambiguous.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to use it as a bang controller to control the direction, keep flying forward, right? So if the world moves to the right, it means you veered off to the left, and you generate a compensatory yaw torque to turn back to the right. For doing that kind of bang control, it's great. It's very reliable. But when you're turning to the right, you want to know how rapidly you're turning. It did not give you a reliable answer.
And then there's another thing that always worried me about the Reichert correlator, is that in some sense it tells us that neurons can multiply. And biophysically, I find it always difficult to comprehend how you could do that.
Actually, we had a cute idea that I published as part of my PhD thesis a long time ago, which I don't think anyone's really picked. You could do it very easily. Okay, just a coincidence detector, neuron, and 2 trains of random spike trains coming in, 2 different frequencies, right? They're random, jitter. So the probability of a coincidence is proportional to F1, frequency 1, times frequency of F2. So the spike rate at the output will be proportional to the spike rates in the input, if you assume randomness.
Right.
If there's no randomness, if they're periodic, then that doesn't work, because you could have either perfect, synchrony or no synchrony.
So is there any evidence for this?
But the moment you have noise, and noise is actually helpful in this case, you will get a beautiful product. I don't know if anyone's found a neuron like that, but I'd love to see a neuron, because we published that a long time ago.
we also briefly discussed the possibility there are other sensors, like it is actually sensing drag in the air or something like that.
Right.
Possibly.
Yeah,
or
certainly.
Combining the visual information.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, there are the antennae are doing all kinds of things. As we were saying, they're probably tactile sensors as well. By the way, just as the beautiful rat whisker story we heard just now, bees look like they're using when they come in close to a surface to land, when the surface is oriented nearly vertically, they're using their antennae to make the first mechanical contact. Also, it seems like the antennae tend to be perpendicular to the surface. As they're coming in and hovering, they have a perception of the surface slant. And you can even fool them by producing optical illusions which simulate different surface slants by having texture gradients. So obviously the visual system is analyzing surface orientation.
Right.
And maybe that's one situation where we could apply this model too. Yeah.
Excellent. So then you haven't said much about the birds yet, and still I want to hear something about it. So
we're just starting. Yeah.
Okay. No, but just at the level of intuition, so now we talked about the bee, we've talked about this sort of bioprincipics and extraction of core design principles of the bee brain. Would you believe that you will also find some of these design principles back into the bird brain?
At least so far, we found a couple of similarities. One again, and this is, again, we haven't tested a whole range of birds. But if you take one of the standard birds in Australia, it's called the budgerigar. Budgies. Do you get budgies here? Maybe?
In the animal store,
in the pet stores. There, it's a kind of an iconic Australian native bird. Anyway, there, if you fly them down a tunnel, they show very similar behavior to what the bees do. So we haven't been able to actually physically move patterns in these tunnels yet. We're starting to do that now with a long tunnel. But you can manipulate the optic flow by having static patterns, which are, for example, horizontal stripes on one side and vertical stripes on the other side. Then you imbalance the optic flow that way, and they behave in exactly the same way that the birds do.
This is interesting in the context of our notion of convergent evolution and understanding engineering principles by looking at convergent evolution. Clearly, if the birds are using the same optic flow mechanisms as the bees are, it will have to be convergent simply because the common ancestor didn't fly.
Yeah. The other thing that seems to be uniformly true in many species, including humans, is the fact that motion perception is largely colorblind. So humans, as you probably know, although we have beautiful color vision, the motion sensing system is almost colorblind. It's driven only by the luminance pathway, red plus green. If you look at the bee, again, it's colorblind. It's driven only by the green receptor, all of the motion sensing. And if you look at the spectral sensitivity function of the green receptor, it sits bang on the sum of, if you take the red plus green cones, our luminance pathway, it sits exactly on top of that. So it's as though that system is adapted exactly to our environment, exactly the same thing. And now we're finding that even birds are like that. At least these budgerigars are behaving as though their perception of motion is also colorblind. Although these birds are have even better color vision. They're tetrachromatic, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And yet
the system is going out of the way to make the motion detection colorblind.
Exactly.
Do we understand why?
But wait, but there can
is
be
that more efficient?
I think the common notion is that the early creatures, and then again, correct me because I'm not an evolutionary biologist, is that most of the early vision systems did not have color. If you needed to have basic motion sensing just in order to move around, and not bump into objects and just navigate safely. And then later on, when flowers evolved in the scene and it became important to recognize objects based on color, that's when color came in. So many people, and this is still a hotly debated topic, but many people think color vision sort of co-evolved with bees and flowers at the same time, pretty much. So there's no fundamental need to have color to begin with.
But now, if on this issue of convergent evolution, right? So you could also argue that there can be, in the end, a common ancestor that just had to move and crawl, right, in a visual world. And that could have picked up these kinds of responses to motion. You don't need to fly to pick that up.
No, absolutely.
So
absolutely.
If you just have to speculate, how would you see this? As indeed convergent evolution to a similar solution between flying insects and birds, or just really a very ancient common ancestor just crawled around?
I would say a very ancient common ancestor is my guess, yeah.
Okay.
But primitive things like phototaxis, going towards a bright light source is probably a very fundamental thing. Going towards something that smells good is probably a good thing.
Right.
And then,
but on the other hand, though, I mean, hummingbirds and bees fly in the same way, and the common ancestors didn't fly. So not everything is convergent. We have to be a little careful about that. In terms of optic flow, do you think that it is indeed in the common ancestor? Are the parameter regimes right? Even though it had to sense motion, do the birds and the bees have a more refined sense of the speed?
Then, for example,
some crawling primitive animal, let's say.
Oh, yeah, they would have a more refined sense.
Like a snail, for instance,
Yeah.
It will respond to moving visual stimuli.
See, my guess is that...
do flying creatures have to have more precise flow detection?
Oh, sure, yeah. They need to have also, depending on the speed of flight, it seems like certainly the nervous system is very different, right? The dynamic properties are very different. Right from the photoreceptors, you have much higher flicker fusion frequency if you've got a fast flying creature, and I would say even the motion sensing units are tuned to their speed. So I would say that a thing like a primitive worm would probably have again the same kind of basic structure for motion detection, because it's not very complicated when you think about it. If you just want to tell which direction something is moving, you just need to have one inhibitory synapse, right, between one photoreceptor and another one. And that could have evolved as early as lateral inhibition,
Exactly.
And so you just modify that a little bit.
Also, actually,
for
any
limulus,
sensor.
it is sort of
Limulus, exactly, yeah.
No, but you could even go to other modalities. If you go to mechanical sensing or chemical sensing, all you want to do is measure a difference. And that's what this is. What is then generalized to some optic sensor. You just measure a difference, and this gives you motion.
But as you were also pointing out, the Reichardt detector, which does that, is not adequate.
It's not adequate.
So therefore, there is something more.
Sure.
Yes, there is something in common.
Yeah.
But
there's more.
Yes, and that is really necessary for this behavior. And you can't do without it.
Yeah, and that's where maybe you even have parallel pathways. My guess is that at least in the bee, there must be several parallel pathways that are sensing different aspects of motion. For example, there's optical avoidance and flying down the middle of a corridor. That motion sensing seems to be non-directional. It's not directional at all. So if you think about it, if you want to avoid an obstacle, you don't really care which way the thing is moving. You just want to avoid it because of its high speed, right? So maybe it's computationally simpler to just do some non-directional motion sensing rather than compute motion direction. It's just not necessary. And this thing has completely different properties. I think things are changing now. I probably shouldn't say this, but as long as Reichardt was alive, there was a big school in Tübingen following the Reichardt model.
Yeah.
But I think now things are starting to
unravel.
Yeah.
Okay. But so to finish up, there are two questions that we actually pose to everybody we interview for the podcast. So there you come out of engineering, discover the bee, do all this fantastic work, have it fly now on these airplanes, move to the bird. So you've been exposed to these different disciplines, trying to extract then these engineering principles of biological systems. So if we would like to follow in that tradition, what's the law of Srini we should adhere to? What's Srini's law?
Srini's law?
Yeah.
Follow your heart. Mm-hmm. Don't worry about where your next job is going to be. Now, just follow your heart, and if you enjoy what you're doing, things will come to you naturally. Do you want me to say briefly what my next thing? I don't know if I will ever get around to doing this, but what my next, I would love to be able to look at higher emotions in simple nervous systems. Mm-hmm. Things like, for example, joy, disappointment, fear, anger, pain. I think there's a whole thing there, and I believe there's an entire continuum, and there's no such thing as, I find it hard to believe that invertebrates, for example, don't feel pain, whereas vertebrates do. There's no hard and fast thing.
So would you speculate then that these animals would qualify for a very primitive form of consciousness?
I would think so. Especially, that headbutting that I mentioned to you. Yeah. That's, I find it hard to believe that's all done in a purely reflexive way. Mm-hmm. Especially because it's so subtle, right? I mean,
headbutting is not that subtle, I have to say. But
no, but the things that control when it headbutts and doesn't headbutt,
right?
It's very precise, right? I mean, the fact that it's exactly that food source is being signaled, and also on how dangerous the predator there is,
right?
I mean. You can't say this is all being done by some stupid automaton, right? I mean, there's more to it.
I think to any of us who've actually watched flies and things closely behaviorally, there's no doubt in our minds that they are conscious.
There's a lot going on, For example, you jab a cat or a dog and it flinches and you say it feels pain. And you jab an insect and it again does the same kind of reaction, but you say, it can't be pain because it's an insect. It must just be a reflex. Right. How do you know, right?
Well, look, this is a great topic for another podcast interview that we're definitely going to have in the near future.
Sorry, I didn't want to launch you off on this.
But no, this is good. But then the final question for me is really, so since Partha is so successful and generates all this money, we can travel around the world on his budget, without any trouble. So 5 years from now, we're going to go visit your lab and we're going to remind you of a hypothesis that you generate today that you feel most passionate about and that you claim will come out 5 years from now. So what's that hypothesis?
My hypothesis will be that insects feel pain.
You're really going to work on that?
If I get the funding, I'd love to.
Okay.
I've got some ways in which they can be tested, I think, which will be a little more more telling than just jabbing the insect and saying it's a reflexive thing, because that doesn't convince people. It convinces me, but it doesn't convince other people. But I think there must be ways around it. You can never make a conclusive proof. But again, as for example, now that they're convinced that fish feel pain, for example, do you know how they finally did it? It's a very cruel. In fact, it involved a bee. They took a bee sting. They took a sting out of a bee and stung the lip of the fish, and the fish twitched. And they said, the fish feels pain. It seemed like a very primitive, unsophisticated experiment. But the world was at the right time to accept that at that point. And they said, fish feel pain. And so from now on, we've got guidelines for experimenting with fish.
So that means now we have to slap a bee with a fish and see if it twitches. I think that's what you're proposing now.
Yeah, the fish will probably twitch, right? Because the bee would have stung the fish.
Exactly.
And the bee doesn't feel the pain, obviously. So you proved two things there. The bee doesn't feel pain and the fish feels pain.
Well, I'm so happy we resolved that issue. So, Srini, thank you very much for this wonderful interview. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Partha.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.